Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion and the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Listeners, welcome to another episode of Religion and the American Experience, a podcast series of the Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcast fix, and tell your colleagues, friends, and family about the podcast. Lodged firmly in the American psyche and a bedrock part of American and personal family histories is the Great Depression. Beginning with the stock market crash in October of 1929, with the market losing 50% of its value in just weeks, and lasting more than a decade, it was the worst calamity to hit the United States since the Civil War. At its worst, 1 out of every 4 workers was unemployed. Farms went under with their former inhabitants leaving their homes seeking shelter, food, and work. Poverty and want were everywhere. The emotional toll on millions was severe. Americans and America were traumatized and transformed. For us at the museum, the question is, in what ways did religion, one of the greatest and most ubiquitous forces in American history, react to the Great Depression? Understanding this will help us comprehend religion's role in the American project today, equipping us to perpetuate and perfect it into the 21st century. As part of our multi-episode series about religion in the Great Depression, Dr. Jonathan Ebel will share the story of New Deal government camps for migrant workers in California and what he calls, quote, the religion of reform, close quote. Dr. Jonathan Ebel is a professor of religion at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago and has a BS from Harvard. Professor Ebel's research program involves religion and war, religion and violence, and lay theologies of economic hardship, all within the American context. He is the author of several books, including From Dust They Came, Government Camps and the Religion of Reform in New Deal, California, GI Messiahs, Soldiering, War, and American Civil Religion, Faith in the Fight, Religion and the American Soldier in the Great War, and is the co-editor of From Jeremiah to Jihad, Religion, Violence, and America. He is currently at work on a religious history of American warfare in 5 weapons. Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us today.
Chris, thank you for the invitation.
First, Jonathan, will you tell our listeners how you came to write this particular book, which unearthed, for me at least, an entirely new and significant story within the Great Depression and America's religious history, which is relevant today?
Sure. I set out originally to write a book that was similar to my first book, Faith in the Fight, about soldiers' religious experiences of World War I. And what I intended to do was to tell a kind of migrant's eye religious history of the experience of displacement and destitution in the Great Depression. And I think, as most people who've started out with a research idea, I pursued that and looked for archives that would support it. And in the process, came to the National Archive Record Administration in San Bruno, California, which houses the records of the camp system that I ended up writing about. And I went into um, that facility and into those papers looking for and to some extent finding migrants' voices. But what I found and ended up writing about was the interaction, the encounter between migrants and New Deal reformers in these camps. So my original research idea led me uh, to a project that I ended up finding um, more interesting, more complicated, and that I couldn't stop thinking about. And so as that process uh, was going, as I was doing the research, I realized that I had a a book that was something that I wanted to spend time with, and that was uh, though a little bit different than what I started out trying to write.
Okay, well, that's helpful. Um, one more way to frame so that helps with our listeners to frame what they're going to hear, but also one more question regarding framing. You write this, Jonathan, in the introduction, quote, "The encounters between a supposedly secular federal program and an unapologetically Protestant people are best understood as encounters between, at least, two religious populations, one thoroughly down on its luck and struggling to make sense of dislocation and destitution, the other powerful and well educated by comparison, and also convinced that their efforts and their truths would lead the others to salvation." Close quote. Can you elaborate a bit on this to help, as I said, set the stage further for our discussion?
Sure, sure. And actually, I want to start by rewinding a bit. In your introductory comments, you said something to the effect that that the question for us is in what ways religion reacted to the Great Depression. And um, my work, especially in this book, is about getting people to notice that religion doesn't exist apart from individual lives and bodies and experiences, and that when we're talking about how religion reacts to something like the Great Depression or war or whatever other event, we're talking about how people reacted. And I think when we're telling the story of people and their religious lives, we're very often drawn to those who are the most obviously religious, whether they're clergy, who've given their lives to the vocation of religious leadership, or those who are in some way obviously or flamboyantly, performatively religious. And um, so when it comes to this story, I really wanted to focus on um, on both the obviously religious, but then those who are less obviously so. The New Deal reformers play that role in this story, um, wanting people to see and understand that these people too had their religious commitments, that they were working within a religious tradition, the kind of the social gospel, progressive social gospel, broadly understood, but also that their commitments, their rituals, their ways of imagining and enforcing community were connected to a worldview that they understood to be right, and that they really wanted the people that they were working among, and displaced and impoverished migrants, to embrace, to convert to. Um, so, um, what I'm saying there in the that you read is pointing toward that it's not just the obviously religious who have religion, that there are really important, productive ways um, for us to think religiously about those who claim a kind of progressive secularity.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you for sort of clearing that up regarding religion and not apart from people. That's exactly right. Um, before, I guess, we actually dive in, can you tell our listeners what the religious landscape was in California? The, it's always in flux, I know, but pre those migrants, and what did it look like? Was it,
Well, yeah, I mean, it sort of depends on where you are. And uh, one thing that I think it's important for listeners um, to think about is the kind of the religious layers of California historically. That the first layer is indigenous religions, Native American religious traditions in in a really amazing variety and diversity. And the first the next layer comes um, with Spanish incursion and the attempts of Catholic uh, missionaries, Catholic mission priests to evangelize native populations, but then also to work among their own. So you have these layers of indigenous religious traditions and Catholicism, and then on top of that, a really vibrant and diverse Protestantism. And so, in some ways, California is a lot like other parts of the United States religiously in the 1930s, with traditions of indigenous religion and Catholicism and Protestantism dating back. And in some ways, what's that California apart, and Laurie Mather Kipp has pointed this out many times, is that it's a part of the Pacific Rim, and so you have Asian religious traditions, Buddhism that have an interesting history in California, um, Sikhism, a South Asian religious tradition that was practiced by and among some of the agricultural workers who were present in California in um, the late 19th and early 20th century. And so there are these other layers of diversity. And so when people think about religious California in the early part of the 20th century, I think they're generally drawn to figures like Amy Semple McPherson, Charles Fuller, the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, these kind of uh, well-known, often described conservative evangelical figures and institutions. And the picture, of course, is just a lot more complicated than that.
right? Okay, I like the way you describe it as layering. That's really a good way to look at religious landscapes in the country. So thank you for that. All right, let's dive in. So tell us about this person called Tom Collins, including his religious down and so who he was religiously, who he was in this book, and what he called the quote gospel of the good neighbor close quote in these government New Deal camps for migrant workers. I think it's important for listeners to understand.
Tom Collins. Yeah, Tom Collins, not just a cocktail, although he seems to have enjoyed them. So Tom Collins is a figure that you can't really avoid in the history of the camp program in California, which was established in 1935 uh, by the Resettlement Administration and a partnership between the federal government and state emergency relief administration. And so Tom Collins is not really the person who imagines the system broadly. He's the one who implements it on the ground. He kind of uh, writes the book as to how the camps should function in their interactions with migrants. And throughout the history of the program, from 1935 all the way through until 1941, 42, 43, he's held up as the exemplary camp manager, which is the primary role that he occupied. He was running individual camps in Marysville and then in Arvin. He went down to Brawley in the far southern part of the state for a while and helped out at the camp there, and was kind of serving as a manager at large, providing help to other camp managers where needed. So he is an absolutely central figure in the migrant camp program in California. He was raised in a Catholic orphanage in Baltimore, and at one point seemed to be on a trajectory to the priesthood, but then pretty suddenly was not, and had a couple of marriages, a couple of families. Uh, a long story short, ended up in Southern California in the early 1930s with a background in education, and was hired the um, by the resettlement administration for this role that he ended up really uh, defining the role of camp manager. So he's a fascinating figure, and kind of articulates more clearly than anybody else what the vision ought to be for the camps, the work that they ought to do, which he sees as working with work, working with migrants in a spirit of respect and equality to rehabilitate them um, economically, professionally, and interestingly also culturally, and as it turns out, religiously as well. Um, and and so really, in some ways, the story of these camps is the story of Tom Collins's vision. He also, interestingly, Chris, is a really direct relation, or a really direct connection between um, between the camp program and the author John Steinbeck. He worked closely with Steinbeck um, to familiarize him with the lives and the work and the culture of migratory farm labor in California during the Depression, and also gave him access to his files for material for what would become the Great Sabbath.
Okay. Yeah, I noted that in the book. That's a cool connection. And his gospel of the good neighbor, is that a good summary of Collins' religious outlook at this point in his life, or just what he decided to emphasize at the camps?
I think what we see in his gospel of the good neighbor is the kind of the missionary purpose of these camps, which is um, to evangelize community and belonging, and to encourage residents to see themselves not as individuals, not as um, isolated actors, but as part of a community that has its standards of behavior and cleanliness and domesticity, um, and and that has legitimate expectations that those who are living in the community abide by those standards,
Okay. Fair enough.
and also the people help each other out. Like that's sort of the essence of Christianity, the essence of religion more broadly, is that people be good to each other.
Okay. Now, one consistent thread I found, Jonathan, in the book that I read of these people and camps in the book is that the Dust Bowl migrants often had this, or very often had this belief that physical sickness was correlated directly with sin, and only needs faith healing and not modern medicine as offered by the camp's administration. Tell us this story and its significance to the overarching story you're telling about
Yeah.
in camps then.
Well, the overarching story, or one of the stories that I'm telling here, is of an encounter between um, evangelists for modernity and people who are pretty committed to what some people might describe as anti-modern views and practices. One of those being that um, sickness is not best described and treated as a physiological problem, not best described and treated scientifically, but best described and treated as a spiritual problem, and described and treated ritually within the context of worship and belief. And so, I mean, that's a narrative that people can trace all the way back to the gospel literature and accounts of the ministry, the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, and indeed those who embrace those views of sickness as primarily spiritual do that. And the more immediate story in the American context is most often connected to Pentecostalism and proto-Pentecostalism, and the belief that baptism in the Holy Spirit doesn't just heal one's soul, it ought to heal one's body. And the kind of the other side of that coin, Chris, is that that if faith or baptism in the Holy Spirit hasn't healed your sickness, then there's something that's faulty about your faith or incomplete about your baptism. Um, so that's a belief that is pretty widespread among the migrant population, many of whom were part of these charismatic Pentecostal traditions back in Oklahoma and Texas and Colorado and Nebraska, etc. And they were living lives as migrants that exposed them to lots of really dangerous diseases, whether those are bacterial diseases, viruses, all manner of ailments, things that are brought on by nutritional deficiencies. And so a part of the modern mission to intervene in the lives of these migrants is to provide them with the highest standard of modern medical care. And I think what a lot of people who are working in the reform tradition, the New Deal reformers rather, within the camps don't appreciate is that by asking migrants to submit to modern medical care, they are in fact asking them to make a religious adjustment, to adjust their religious worldview, to adjust their religious practices. And some migrants are willing to do that. Some experience the results of a successful treatment and are pleased with that, and others are not. And others will avoid the camps because the word gets out that if you're going to live in the camp, you have to submit to a medical examination and to regular kind of checkups with the camp medical staff.
Okay. Is there a
Does that help
story?
clarify?
It does. Is there a story that stands out in your mind of a actual confrontation, an encounter with maybe a faith healing that was going on, and then camp administration comes by and interacts? And I mean, did it get down to that granular level where camp administration would disrupt those and say you need to go to a doctor, or how did that play out? Do you have a story?
Well, so I mean, this is part of I guess what we can call the genius of Tom Collins as the camp manager is that yes. So the very short answer is yes. There are direct encounters between camp staff, between camp managers, and faith healing services. And there are migrants who are living in the camps who don't like the faith healing services, who find them to be noisy and disruptive, and would like them to end for other reasons. But there's a story from the summer of 1936 when Tom Collins is kind of responding to, he's trying to suss out who it is that's involved in faith faith healing services, um, and he writes about hearing them. He can kind of understand what's happening in a service based on the kind of the tenor, the tone of the singing and the vocalizations, but that he's frustrated because when he shows up, it's as if there's sort of someone who's keeping watch and lets people know that he's coming, and people sort of disband or lie down or quiet down. Um, and in that story and a number of others, he is able, through sort of the suggesting gently, uh, um, to, to bring the people, to bring some of the people who are involved in the faith healing around to a willingness to sit down with a nurse or a doctor. Um, in one case, it's pneumonia, and they're able to treat that. Uh, and so that's one story among many that I found in the archives.
Okay. And it doesn't seem to me that, from my reading of Tom Collins, that he was um, critical of faith healings per se, but he was critical of of them not being open to modern medicine. That is, he saw them as not necessarily that he didn't seem critical of faith healings from that perspective, just that he wanted people to also avail themselves of modern medicine. Is that a fair reading of Tom's religious outlook on?
I think, yes, I think that's fair. That you know he's he's committed to First Amendment freedoms and doesn't want to be seen as infringing on people's uh, rights of free exercise, particularly within the framework of a government camp. Um, he wants people to be able to hold both, what some would describe as faith in the great physician, with trust in a decent doctor. So people can have both of those things. Um, but from a kind of public health perspective, it the second part, the trust in a good doctor, is important if people are going to live in kind of close quarters in the camp where viruses can run rampant.
Right. Okay, sort of in a similar vein, you write, Jonathan, that camp administrators, quote, hoped migrants would become enduringly suspicious of the charismatic and revivalistic practices that so often guided them. Within the gate, camp officials resisted the expansive role that religion often played in the lives of migrants, close quote. And, quote, one report conveys a concern that the migrants' omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent God left little space for the necessary work of rehabilitation, close quote. And then this, you say that, and I agree that this is how I read it, Tom Collins and government camps in general were respective of First Amendment freedoms. But what you write here says that there is some undercurrent, some pressure amongst administrative people that they began to look critically upon religion. That they were struggling with that balance. Flesh this out a bit for our listeners.
Yeah. So I want to encourage readers to see these camps as missionary environments, as places where one group of people was, well, I mean, to be fair, multiple groups of people were working to convert each other to different ways of thinking about and moving through the world. And one of the places that becomes clearest to me is in the way that the camp staff, the New Deal reformers, are working to sculpt and restrain the religious practices of migrant populations. And I'm sure we're going to come back to this a couple times um, in this conversation. But I don't see them as caring a whole lot about what the theological content is of a migrant person's Protestantism. Um, I don't think that it matters to them a whole lot whether they identify themselves as Pentecostal, as evangelical, as committed to faith healing or not. Um, they just need to rein it in. They need to observe the sort of the boundaries that modernity would impose on religious practice and therefore to some extent in religious belief. They don't really want to make space for people whose beliefs are going to upend the whole project.
I see.
And, so I mean, it's in some ways a messy distinction between belief and practice. And in asking people to rein it in, you are in some ways asking them to change the theological claims that they're making. But the reformers in the camps don't necessarily see that as troubling, because what they're trying to achieve is an environment that is largely unified, largely peaceful, in which people can go about their lives being religious how they want to be religious, but in ways that don't pick anybody else's pocket or break anybody else's leg.
Okay.
How's that?
Way to bring Thomas Jefferson in. Okay. Can you tell us about the 1936 letter from a lady named Nellie Porter of Walnut Creek, California, who self-identified as a member of a, quote, missionary society, close quote, to Tom Collins, who was then, he was a manager of a camp, and Assistant Director Thompson's reply, and what this all represents? I think this is an important story. At least I found it to be one.
Sure. Well, I'm glad that you pointed this out, and it's an interesting story on a number of levels. It's interesting in the way that it shows information flowing within the federal migratory camp system, the way that bureaucracy works, and the way that knowledge is produced about the migrant population. And in short, the person who wrote the letter, Nellie Porter, is looking for information for her sort of Bible study group, if you will, that they're interested in the migrant, what they call the migrant problem, migrants and the challenges that they're facing. And so they turn to this administration that they know exists, whose work they're sort of familiar with, and say, tell us what's going on. Tell us who these people are. Tell us what you can about them. Because Porter in particular says that her information is coming from newspapers. She realizes that those can be biased. She also lives in an agricultural community and feels like she's maybe too influenced by the grower's perspective on the problem of migratory farm labor. So the response to her request is one that really I think paints paints a positive picture of the migrant population and works to connect these people who are living literally at the margins of California agricultural society to those who are living in its center, and saying in so many ways they are exactly like you and me. They're hardworking, they're committed to their families, they are earnest, they are ethical, um, and they kind of embody what Thompson and Collins describe as sort of the essence of this gospel of the good neighbor, um, and that they've gone through a lot, and that it's kind of remarkable that they remain as optimistic and as committed to the American project as they do. And so that's an example of a response coming out of the camp system that is really working to connect the migrant population to the more settled population. It's not the only way that information is being used that comes out of the migrant camp system. It's not the only kind of knowledge that's produced, but it is one kind, and it's important in this case.
Okay, and did Nellie Porter do outside groups, religious groups, try to help? Uh, was that part of their interest to support what was going on, to help or to evangelize, to go in and talk to people about church and things and religion?
Yeah, I mean there are a wide range of religious responses to the migrant problem that fall outside of the boundaries of this camp system, and some of them are explicitly evangelistic. Some of them are more focused on kind of a social gospel rehabilitation. And there are those that engage directly with the migratory farm labor camp program and ask for access to lead worship services, um, take up collections in their churches of clothing and books, and then they donate them to the camps. Um, so there's kind of a predictable menu, Chris, of religious responses from California denominations and
Yep.
um,
Okay. Yeah,
ministries.
that's what I figured, but not part of really your analysis here. Okay. Tell us briefly about this lady named Georgie Nunn. I think that would be she figured somewhat prominently in the book. Who was she and what did
She
she
does.
do?
Georgie's wonderful, and then there are some ways in which I owe this book to Georgie. It was reading her story in the archives at the National Archive and Record Administration in San Bruno, um, that that really helped me see a lot of what the dynamics were that I went on to write about, and also put a human face and body to those dynamics. So she's a young or early 20s year old uh, Pentecostal evangelist who came with her family from Oklahoma to California, family of 11 or 12, and ended up in the Arvin migratory farm labor camp in Kern County in California. And so as uh, a Pentecostal evangelist, she did in that camp what she was sort of committed to doing, which is trying to evangelize, reaching out to people, talking to people, intervening in their lives. And this is a camp that Tom Collins was running, and he found her to be, I think, um, uh, an interesting figure, a problematic figure, a disruptive figure. So he had this kind of crazy idea, Chris, which was to hire her as his housekeeper. And so, and he did that both because he probably could use some help with cooking and keeping house, but also because he wanted to pull her close and observe her and keep her from being too disruptive of the camp. Um, and she was pretty much an unmitigated disaster in her role as housekeeper and cook. But she by being close to um, Collins physically, he was able to learn something about Pentecostalism, some things that he probably didn't know before, and to write about them. And so their interaction generated a whole bunch of stories um, uh, that sort of um, help us appreciate how a New Deal reformer would see and feel about a fairly unbridled Pentecostal evangelist in his presence. Um, so, to make a long story short, the Collins has to let her go as his housekeeper. She ends up getting married, and her husband wasn't really thrilled that she had that job in the first place, and she wasn't doing it well anyway from Collins' perspective. So that relationship ended, but her imprint in the archive, and then subsequently in in The Grapes of Wrath in Steinbeck's novel, is really fascinating, and also allows us to see then how it is that knowledge produced about migrants and migrant religion becomes a whole other set of narratives and ideas and characters in the American literary canon. Um, and so that's Georgie. She's fascinating. I've got a picture of her in the book, and some stories that are fun and to some at least a little bit funny.
Okay, thank you. You write, Jonathan, that camp officials would link, and this was also something that was somewhat of a prominent thread, I thought, that camp officials saw domestic order and cleanliness. I'm sorry, they linked domestic order and cleanliness to proper religion. This was important to them, and they saw it and such. How did they do that?
Well, they did it rhetorically quite forcefully, and throughout the life of the camp program, that people who were good citizens, good neighbors, good modern American subjects were clean. That they kept clean houses, and they used modern sanitation facilities, and they've made that connection again and again and again. And there were programs within the camps, both kind of domestic home economics type programs and programs um, encouraging people to use properly the flush toilets and showers that were provided in the camps. Um, that encouraged proper ritual interaction with the technologies that enabled a clean house, and a clean body, and a clean community. Um, in terms of the sort of communal dynamic, many camp managers used, I guess, what we could think of as kind of peer pressure or communal pressure, competitions the um, within the camp for which little subdivision or neighborhood within the camp had the cleanest tent platforms and the cleanest yards around the tent platforms, um, and used children as kind of um, not so much enforcers but observers and encouragers of their fellow kids and their parents to keep their domestic spaces clean and orderly. So there's this whole culture of um, cleanliness being rewarded, cleanliness being connected to virtue that we can see both being enforced through rhetoric and through ritual, through practice.
Okay. All right. In your chapter about the community center, you write this, quote, when Protestant belief kept migrants from participating in recreational activities, Collins felt the need to counter and circumscribe it, close quote. What is the story here about the migrant workers' religion and their recreation that is important for our listeners to know?
So I think it's important to know, first of all, that there's a long tradition of skepticism and hostility within uh, Christianity, within Protestantism, toward the arts, toward theater, towards performance, and various types of non sacred music. Um, and so those people who are skeptical of plays being put on within the camps or concerts being staged within the camps are working within a long, um, a long Christian tradition. And what Collins is saying, and is saying in his words and in his actions, isn't just what's the big deal? Why do you care so much about us putting on a play? Why do you care so much about a concert? Um, what he's saying is that this particular hangup, this particular what he thinks is a misunderstanding of the arts and theater, etc., um, is cutting against the very important, also religious work of community building. That there's some really important communal experiences to be had, um, pulling together and putting on performances that this particular subset of the camp population is working against. So he wants to either marginalize them, but actually preferably bring them in, get them involved, and the path that he chooses for that is to work with their children, and eventually in that part of his work he's successful. A lot of those who are initially skeptical of camp plays and camp concerts end up getting involved in them anyway.
Okay. What a laboratory these camps were for religion coming into the, you know, to modernity. Wow. What a fascinating thing. Let's see. What did Protestantism look like as scheduled in the community center? Give us a short answer here.
Well, it looked like any other activity. Listed on the schedule of the community center, something that you would go and do for an hour and a half or an hour, and then go on and do something else. And I think that was part of the function of the community center religiously, was to contain religion, to make it something that you go and do for some time on Sunday, and then go play softball, go play uh, croquet or some other activity.
Okay. Fair enough. Let's see. In Report to the Day, you write that there is not a, quote, single critical word about the Ummels, Reverend Peach, or the Migrant Gospel Fellowship, close quote, each of which embraced fundamentalist theology, otherworldly apocalypticism, inattention to the social gospel, and a spirit of divisiveness. Why was that? Why did we not see critical words in the reports about these things that tended to disrupt their project, or could disrupt their project at the camps?
Well, I think we don't see a critical word because they didn't. They colored within the lines. Chris and Reba Ummel were missionaries associated with the Migrant Gospel Fellowship, um, which was founded by Reverend Peach, and uh, they helped the project. They fit the mold. They didn't, as I said, color outside the lines religiously, and I think it goes to show that the concern for many of the camp managers and staff wasn't really a theological concern. It was a spatial concern, like, um, will these religious actors observe the boundaries of proper religious practice within the camps? And the Ummels and Peach and the Migrant Gospel Fellowship did just that.
Okay. We're nearing conclusion. A couple more questions. In your chapter about the camp newspapers, which were fascinating to read. You had pictures of some of those newspapers. You write about poetry that appeared in their pages in this way, quote, "What all of the poems names, some more quietly than others, was a feeling of alienation, alienation from the land, from religious practice, from a world rightly ordered, from consensus about the demands of Protestant faith," close quote. Can you share a poem and what that particular poem represents?
Sure. I'll share a couple stanzas if that's okay, rather than a whole poem. Um, and this is one that was written by Jack Bays and was published in the Covered Wagon News, one of the camp newspapers in 1940. And he titled his poem Kidnappers of Jesus. The first stanza reads, "With soothing words the master came to those of low estate, and like the men of God before, he scorned the rich and great. Down through the years his host has been the crushed and poor and sad. They've loved and held him in their heart, the only friend they had." The narrative that Bayes tells here, Chris, is one of alienation, one of the kidnapping of Jesus from and his removal from connection with the poor. The poem concludes, "What right have you to claim our Lord and so blaspheme his name? How dare you drive away the poor by boasting such a claim? To win the public favor and make your profits sure, you've taken Jesus from his own, the meek and lowly poor." Um, which I think is a really beautiful, poetic way of expressing the frustration that some in the camp surely felt that um, the mainstream of Protestantism in California, in America, was embracing capitalism and embracing and sanctifying the wealthy and forgetting this other significant strand in Christian life and thought.
Well, there's a lot to think about there. It's just wonderful for us to get a sense of that. I think very, very helpful to us at this point in America, in the American project. Okay, second to last question. In 1944, a graduate student named James Bright Wilson did his dissertation about Protestant lives of migrants inside and outside of the camps. Can you share briefly with our listeners what you think are the most important findings of his study?
Well, James Bright Wilson was a cheerleader for, an advocate of the social gospel, and really wanted to find, I think, that social gospel affiliated uh, ministers and ministries within California were taking hold, were winning converts from within the migrant population. And what his dissertation shows, I think, somewhat unintentionally, is that that wasn't the case. I mean, he really didn't like the Migrant Gospel Fellowship. He didn't like other conservative evangelical ministries that were at work, um, but the migrants tended to, and so that was a fact that he was wrestling with throughout the dissertation. And for me, it's another in the book. It's another way of thinking about um, how it is that reform-minded, generally left-leaning Protestants read the situation in California and were not especially successful in reaching migrants.
Okay, good to know. As we conclude, Jonathan, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from the book, either in terms of important historical transformations you are charting, or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
Yes. Um, One thing, and many people have said this before me, is that secularism isn't. That there are ways in which secular programs, secular thought reflects deep religious commitments and deep investments in a particular form, and in some cases, particular content to religion in American life. I also think it's important to note that reform work is tricky and is always an encounter that plays out in ways that don't always line up with what the goals of reformers are. Another way of thinking about that is that the subjects of reform programs have agency, and but their attempts to shape their worlds matter and deserve voice, deserve attention, both historically and in the work of reform. Lastly, I wouldn't want it to be a lesson of this book that the work of reform is bad or illegitimate. I think it's really important that people see the problems in the world around them and do their best to try to fix them. That's how I read a lot of these people who were involved in the New Deal in California. They were working hard to make the lives of migrants, which were really difficult lives of suffering and sickness and poverty and marginalization. They were working really hard to try to make those better. And their work didn't always go the way that they intended it to, and it wasn't always perfect. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to make the world around us a better place. And so those are three lessons, I think.
Okay, thank you. Very important lessons indeed. We have been talking with Dr. Jonathan Ebel, author of From Dust They Came, Government Camps and the Religion of Reform in New Deal, California. Listeners, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts fix. If you enjoyed this episode, please write a review. Jonathan, thank you for being with us and helping us comprehend the American project better by understanding how religion, fueled by the idea of religious freedom as found in the U.S. Constitution, played into the New Deal migrant worker camps in California during the Great Depression. It was super informative and enlightening. I hope you've enjoyed the time with us as well.
I have very much, Chris. Thank you very much.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.